welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Robinson. Joining me today, and this is quite a treat for me, Joseph Dougherty, award-winning writer for television and stage. He's won an Emmy for his work on the TV show 30-something, which I very much enjoyed. I was perhaps an unusual 13-year-old. He has a new book out, Rod Serling at 100, One Writer's Acknowledgment. And thank you so much for joining us to talk about the book.
Thank you. And actually, after that introduction, I'm sorry I didn't wear a tie. I should have spiffed it up a little bit here, but
this is quite a treat for me. I think fans of the podcast or my Substack won't be surprised that this is going to be airing on New Year's, because that's sort of the Twilight Zone day for fans of the show like myself. Yeah. I'm a tremendous fan of Rod Serling in particular. He's sort of a personal inspiration. Since I was a kid, I've read everything kind of written about him and his work and the show. But what I think I appreciate most about your book is that you are, obviously an acclaimed writer yourself. And I've always chafed at the idea that Twilight Zone is some sort of guilty pleasure or that Serling was a pulp writer. I think he's one of the greats. And it's sort of, you give him his flowers, to use that term, as someone in the field to kind of look at it as a writer and his impact on the work. So can you just tell us what inspired you to write about Serling?
Well, I'll tell you right now, your reaction to the book is incredibly satisfying because it's exactly what I wanted to do. I realized that I realized about a year ago that we were coming up on his centenary. He was born on Christmas Day, 1924. So this was going to be the 100th anniversary of his birth. And I thought this was going to be, if I was ever going to sit down and really talk about him and talk about what he's meant to me and the kind of writer he is, this would be the moment to do it. And it's kind of worked out rather well. I either had very neglectful or very indulgent parents, but I am of an age where I was able to be exposed to the Twilight Zone as a kid in its original broadcast. And when you're a kid, you're kind of a sponge for everything around you, but you're pretty quick at determining what the good stuff is and what the bad stuff is. And Serling, his storytelling, his approach to storytelling, and his physical presence as a writer who had a job, and his job was storytelling, standing there in one at the beginning of the Twilight Zone episodes after the first season he just narrated, standing there being a writer and saying, these are written stories, these are handcrafted objects, and we want you to pay attention. And pretty much from that moment on, even though I recognize a little bit more in retrospect, like is usually the case, that's how I started to become a writer. And it's been just, his influence has never left me. And we can go granular on this in terms of overall impact and specific impact. But at this point, as we look at his 100th birthday, he was only 50 years old when he died in 1974. I'm sorry, 1975. I think it was a tremendous loss to television and to education, since he said himself that working in television was not for anyone under 40 years old. Mm-hmm. I fortunately have been able to disprove that slightly, but he was becoming an amazing teacher at Ithaca and at some other places where he visited. And I encountered him when I was in college and pretty much made an idiot of myself in the process. So maybe this book is an apology. I'm not so sure. I just wanted to put him in a kind of perspective for myself, and also a perspective in a larger sense for television. I'm not the first one to make this observation, but Rod Serling is arguably the first showrunner. Mm-hmm. He is the first writer who took complete control of a television program. And even when he worked with other writers, he worked with the best, Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson and Earl Hamner. They were always in service of his vision, and his vision supported their words. I don't know if you get a Gene Roddenberry without Rod Serling.
Oh, absolutely.
Or Jordan Peele, or anybody who, and it's interesting. One of the great experiences since the book has come out is having conversations with people like yourself and realizing it's a lasting legacy. It keeps going on. And we're talking about a man who wasn't very certain of his own legacy in his final days. He was concerned that he hadn't done any. As a matter of fact, when it comes down to what he thought was important, his headstone does not identify him as a writer. His headstone identifies him as a World War II veteran.
Mm-hmm.
That was what was important to him. That's what he felt he wanted to say about it. He's a damn good writer and a great storyteller. And
World War II definitely seemed to have influenced him and his just how he viewed the world. There was a sense of, and your thoughts on this, his concepts of mortality and loss, I think, were far more in depth than, when I was 35, certainly when he was starting the show, because of what he had lived through.
He had it's interesting. He had an experience which was not unusual for his generation. He was class of 43 in high school at Binghamton. 3 days after his graduation, he enlisted. So he went into World War II. He went into the Pacific Theater as an 18-year-old, and all he had known was his hometown in Binghamton. And I sometimes try to pull myself back from this, but you can look at the forming moments in his life as the comparative idealism of growing up in the small town of Binghamton in central New York and going to the Philippines. And yes, death all around him, death next to him, death in front of him. His father died of a heart attack at the age of 53 while he was overseas and he wasn't able to get back. Maybe that's one of the reasons why his best work seems to be about, you need to do something now.
Mm-hmm.
You need to pay attention. You need to take action. What I found, the gift that writing this book gave to me was I really got engaged with the urgency of Rod Serling's writing. You can fault him sometimes on the construction of his storytelling because he wrote more than 90 of the 160 some odd Twilight Zone episodes. That's a lot of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's writing when you're inspired, and that's writing when something starts shooting next Tuesday.
Yeah.
But he meant what he said. He said, you can praise me, you can hit me with the brickbats if it's mine, but I never wrote down. He was like, I've started to connect him with playwrights like Clifford Odets, who felt, there's a purpose to this. There's more to it. I can entertain you, but I better do something else. This is something I think I learned on Thirtysomething, was basically, you don't have to teach something when you write, but you have to be aware of the fact that people are going to learn something from what you write. And he's just, what else can I tell you about Rod?
Yeah, well, we were talking about going granular here. I actually want to touch on what you said earlier about being one of the first showrunners. And my studies, I really do think his presence, we have even, today, like from Tarantino, or you said Jordan Peele, or, Woody Allen, people who we associate kind of a celebrity writer of a sort. He was also an amazing performer, if you think about it. Like, I was looking at, it's very hard not to try to read his dialogue without his performance, isn't? And I was thinking, this is it's like an actor. Like, I tried Portrait of a Town Drunk named Al Denton. This is a man who's begun his dying early, a long, agonizing route for a maze of bottles. Now, not only is it just beautifully written, again, I'm resisting, and I want to make clear, I was resisting not doing it beat for beat, because if you watch it and you go, he has such a unique presence.
There's a clip to it. And it's interesting. He actually, at one point, I don't have the exact quote in front of me. He was amused by his own presence. He was saying things like, I'm just a schlubby guy who's I think he was like 5'5" or something. He was not an impressive guy, but he said, put me in a suit and put me in front of the camera, and I'm just the most amazingly sage person you've ever met. I love his language. I love the clip. I love the fact that he would not write down, that he painted these spectacular word pictures of people. And his introductions are an example of that. You see quotes from actors like Jack Klugman, who basically said, you just took the script. You just did it. If it was Serling, you knew you would have something to play with. You knew you would have something to play. You knew you would have a language to roll around with. Is it profoundly realistic language the way we've come to understand it? No, it's theatrical, but it's a theatrical setting, and dialogue, is speech with think time, and Serling's language is the flipping best. And I steal some of his tricks, which is like, instead of, I'll use proper names in dialogue, which he did all the time because he liked to build little spaces. So people, somebody wouldn't say, I'm going to tell you something, you're an idiot. It would be, I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Jones, you're an idiot. Just build that little space in there. Because if you ever get a chance to see his typescripts, his original typescripts, they are stark and bare and very little stage direction. And what's there is like really practical to get people across the room. To him, it was the dialogue. The dialogue would inform the motion, and the dialogue would inform the action. And he loved language. He was a guy who, I was talking about this to somebody the other day. Serling's generation, that generation that served in World War II and was in high school then, had a kind of weirdly wonderful, and I don't think it's around anymore, liberal, small L, liberal arts education. Mm-hmm. He's a man who would have had English courses that would have had big, thick poetry anthologies, and they would have read a lot of poetry, and it creeps into his language as well. And he quotes poets that I'm pretty sure he learned about in high school from the high school teachers he continues to honor.
He made a lot of great choices. Something I've adapted a few things from other works like books of the stage and so forth. But one thing I was inspired from him is if you go and you look at certain changes that he made to stuff he got, sometimes small. So like the Invaders, Richard Matheson script, it's a very famous episode. I think he changes the intro so that the reveal, I think the original Matheson script reveals that it's not Earth. He removes that so that you identify with Agnes Moorehead's character immediately because you just assume that she's, one of us. And also the Hitchhiker, where he, I think, decided to cast a woman, and by casting a woman in that just changes the entire, and it makes it more tense, and
it does.
Even nothing now.
It's interesting that it's like it's Inger Stevens, and you identify with her in her prompts. The radio play, it was Orson Welles, and you don't really figure Orson Welles as a vulnerable character. Yeah. I think one of the most interesting things one of the most interesting changes he made is in a script he didn't write, which is A Game of Pool, which was written by George Clayton Johnson.
Oh yeah.
He changed the ending if I'm getting this right, George Clayton Johnson had the Jack Klugman character lose and die and be forgotten. And Serling said, no, he should win and learn the cost of winning.
Oh yeah.
And that's a way better ending.
Oh, absolutely. I think later versions that I've done, I think other Twilight Zone adaptations kept, I think, the original script. And I remember thinking, why did you do that? And I remember reading that, and it's like, oh yes, that was the original. Serling made a much better choice because it was like, you ask those questions. Obviously, this as a writer, you're making, what is a more interesting outcome? And so, yeah, he loses, okay, and you're forgotten. That you can kind of see going. But to like there's a price to what you're getting
Yeah.
is very profound, and it's like such a sharp concept that he had, and like so much of his work, I think.
I don't think we would have. I don't think we'd be remembering that episode as well if it had been. Oh yeah, there's your lesson. Yeah, you're going to be forgotten.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's sort of the price of his own fame, right? And this, ironically, because people think of him as this guy who did Twist, and that's what a Twilight Zone is. And
It
there's so
is.
much more to that. He did so much the human stories, and often, again, it was like what you got is what you shouldn't have gotten. And I think it is so and the way he sort of sided, I think, with the little people, the idea of like the guy who thinks he's going to reign over these people, and then essentially someone else comes and rules over him. It was just such a awareness. It's beyond the twist. It's to the point of he's talking about humanity in a very profound way. That was always sort of the through line with him.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things we have to do now, because of what's happened, is the twists aren't surprising anymore, because some people, have been tipped off. It's a world of spoiler alerts, but the fact is we keep watching them even when we know where the twist is. Yeah, there are some things that you can see. He was not a fan of despots.
Mm-hmm.
He was very concerned about society and conformity. He was. I mean, one of the stock lines that I came up with, and it doesn't bother me so much because it seems to be completely true, is that the Twilight Zone was a place where you may not get what you want, but you always get what you've been asking for. And and you've been asking for it, buddy. Here it is. You're gonna get what you wanted. And see,
it's interesting because I think one of the darkest I was always surprised that he had written it because that theme, The Long Morrow, because you watch it and it's very, I always find it's just a sad, bittersweet ending. I'm not going to spoil it, but it seems like, oh, you're watching it and thinking, well, I don't feel like anyone did anything wrong. There was always like, usually for the script, someone did something or wanted something. And then as you look at it, it's a very complex sense of maybe we do need to accept that we can't get everything we want, and sometimes trying bites us, but I think it's still there, and how he views the world is still there.
Long Morrow, if we talk about influences, I think Long Morrow is a science fiction O. Henry story.
Mm-hmm.
And the other great O. Henry story he wrote is Dust, about the hanging in the small town. You do pay attention to irony, and my brief encounter when I was in college, when Serling came and talked to us, I was totally gobsmacked, and I made a complete idiot of myself. And I take great comfort in knowing I'm sure he didn't remember it, but it's like I remember talking to him briefly about Burgess Meredith breaking his glasses at the end of Time Enough at Last, and I said, why was it necessary for the glasses to break? And he said something to the effect of, nuclear war shouldn't benefit anyone. And I realized, what would you have had if it was just a pullback to this lonely little man who would read forever? Why we remember it because of the ending.
Oh yeah.
And
I think he is commenting on you shouldn't withdraw from society. And as someone who I certainly identified with Burgess Meredith as a kid, I think a lot of us who are writers might have, of like, I just want everyone to go away and leave me alone. Let me just read my comics or my books or whatever. It's like, well, no, you can't do that. And it shouldn't, again, nuclear war shouldn't benefit everyone. And it's such a profound, but again, more than just a twist. I do think that's why the show has endured, because there's more to it beyond the twists. You do something very interesting in the book, of how you group some of his works together amongst a theme, which I really appreciated. The one thing I'd love to ask you about the two bookends, Walking Distance and A Stop at Willoughby, and how your take on them has perhaps changed, or your appreciation. Can you tell folks about that?
Well, again, we do it. See, we'll do this with a spoiler alert, but actually, there are not a big spoilers in that one. For anyone who doesn't know, Walking Distance is about a man who is a successful guy in the city. He drives out of town, has some car trouble, realizes he's within walking distance, a mile and a half of his old hometown, and he says, "Okay, you fix my car. I'm gonna walk into town." And he walks into town and slowly realizes it's not 1959 in this town. It's the town he lived in when he was a boy, and he actually sees himself as a kid in there. And it becomes about, can you go back? Is there room for you if you go back? And eventually it's his father who, and it's the first time I wrote about this was because there's a scene between the father who's talking to the stranger, and the last scene is the father who realizes he's talking to his adult son, and the father sees how much turmoil his son is, and the only advice he can give him is, you should look forward. You should go, you should, he has a wonderful line, is like, you can't steal this summer from
Yeah.
this other boy. It's one summer to a customer.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the character says goodbye to his dad, steps on a carousel, and returns, and we see him driving off to New York. We don't know what's going to happen to him, but he's decided to continue. Stop at Willoughby is a warped mirror of that. It's an executive. He's under a lot of pressure. He's miserable. He's miserable on the job. He's miserable at home. And he commutes back and forth between these two very unpleasant places. And one night on the commute, he falls asleep and dreams about a stop on the line that's not there, a town called Willoughby, a perfect, perfect, perfect town. And he longs for it. It's something, it just will be quiet and slow. And somebody says it's a town where you can slow down and live to your full measure. And at the end of the episode, without blowing everything, he makes a choice to try to get off the train and stay at Willoughby. And it turns out not to be what he thought it was. That's as far as I'll go
Yes,
with that.
yes. I'll appreciate. I think
Um,
people should enjoy that episode
yeah,
as it is, because I think it's really good, and it definitely has more of a twist than Walking Distance. Though Walking Distance is very moving. Especially again, it's one of those ones. As I get older, starting as a kid watching
yeah,
these shows, and later you sort of appreciate Serling's work. And this episode in particular, obviously the father does not recognize his adult son. So implicit in that is that his father has obviously passed away at some point. As someone who's
yes,
lost a parent, you you desire that I to have gone back to have that conversation with my mother who's passed away. My father's still with me, but to be there, finding the strength to leave, and knowing that she'd probably give me the same counsel, but finding the strength to leave, that simplicity to and that again is tough, and it makes you appreciate the ending and the choices much better. It's like you've got to go forward. You only get one ending, and of course people should watch this episode. It's a wonderful Serling
yeah.
monologue at the end.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to mention that. It's one of his. It's just haunting, the way, and you hear him. It's so personal for him, because
Yeah.
that town in walking distance is his hometown. It's Binghamton, which he loved, and that he lived near it was called Recreation Park. He rode that carousel, and and now he's so well remembered at Binghamton. They just finally, not finally, it took a long while, it was a struggle, put this beautiful statue of him up in the same park close to the carousel. So he is remembered very well in Binghamton by those people. But walking distance, it's interesting. You get the same thing as you grow older if you read Ray Bradbury. Suddenly there are things in these pieces you didn't see. Maybe when you're a kid, you got off on the robots and the Martians and the twist endings, but there's so much meat on those bones in a 25-minute script. There's so much language. There's so much observation, wisdom, and warning. But none of it some people accused him of being, didactic and, forcing education. No, I think I think the model for a 25-minute Twilight Zone episode, and all but 19 of them are half-hour episodes. They're only 19 hours. And the hours are not as successful. There are some toweringly good hour episodes, but the batting average isn't the same. But the 25-minute episodes, they're so tight, they're so aggressive, they're parables.
Mhm.
And if you approach them that way, there's, and a parable doesn't really give you the answer. Parable sets you up to think about things. And there he was, pretending to do a series that didn't mean anything, just a little science fiction entertainment. And he said this in an interview. He said, no, I'm not going to be doing anything serious. And he said it at a point that he had written the first scripts of Twilight Zone, which is a bald-faced lie. He knew exactly what he was doing.
Oh
He
yeah.
says, if you won't let me talk about the problems that are in reality, I'll talk about the same problems, but I'll put it in context. You won't even know what I'm doing. You'll think. This is another thing. One of the unanticipated advantages is he legitimized science fiction to a great extent in 1959. It was a Saturday morning thing. It was not adult stuff. But here was, at the time, I think he had 3 Emmys under his belt for Playhouse 90 and other things. And he said, no, this is a tremendously valuable tool for telling stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you had talked about Death's Head Revisited is one example of him being very angry. It's just very powerful. Obviously addressing Nazism, the Holocaust. It's 20 years later. There's some lines that really resonate. I mean, when the Nazi character, like, look, I was just following orders. Why do we dwell in the past? Which is a term that I think still you hear. What are your thoughts on that episode? Because you have a great bit about, like, it's just angry. It's essentially
it is angry. Serling could be very angry, and sometimes arguably he lost complete control of his anger, but not in Death's Head Revisited. There's nothing dusty about Death's Head Revisited. It's set in like 1945 or so, but it's just timely as anything. And there's no, in a weird way, there's no real twist in Death's Head. You figure it out way before it's after World War II, and the commandant of a concentration camp has returned to Bavaria to relive the good old days.
Mm-hmm.
And he revisits his old camp, and he has some great nostalgic thoughts of torture and death and being in charge. And he's confronted by an emaciated man in prisoner pajamas who welcomes him back and knew that he would come back, and we're very glad you came back. And the Nazi is so arrogant, he doesn't even remember that this man is dead. He says, "Oh, you're the caretaker." And the man said, "Yes, I guess I am the caretaker." Mm-hmm. And what I realized writing about it this time was, he said, I wanted to come back. I wanted to relive the good old days. And at the end of the episode, he is permitted. He will relive the good old days. However, with one of the basic things that the Twilight Zone does is, yes, but you will relive it. You will relive it now as a victim.
Mm-hmm.
You will spend eternity experiencing what the 8 million experienced. And someone asks, why do they keep the Docked House up? Why are they still here? A doctor asks at the end of the dialogue. And Serling's ending narration is, we can't forget. Yeah. We have to remember. And again, it's a great,
one of the best.
It was a time when we decided to shovel our humanity into a grave. And so,
yeah,
he meant this stuff. And if people, you can't condemn him because he meant it. The other thing I said basically is, you can quibble about various things, but I don't think he wrote an insincere line of dialogue in
No.
his life.
Well, and some of the stuff, I mean, almost sort of like op-eds that you could imagine, but like the line in Monsters Do on Maple Street, which he has when the reveal at the end, and so not to give that away, but just they pick the most dangerous enemy they can find, and it is themselves. And I've quoted that often about because I write about politics. It'll be something that just, whether it's school shootings or war, whatever, it just always, I find myself, I've clipped it because it's like, oh wow, this is Serling in 1959 putting the pin on something that still endures for good. The Shelter, again, there's so many.
Yeah. But this is all these wonderful the conversation we're having. It always comes down to episodes. You wrote a lot of other things besides Twilight Zone, but if you have to stake your legacy on those episodes, you're in great shape. I remember seeing The Shelter as a kid, and I couldn't sleep that night. And it's one of the things I like to do is I paired The Shelter with monsters, because they are, The Shelter is kind of Monsters Do on Maple Street without the aliens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also about a year or two later, it's a season 2 or season 3 show, and things have gotten kind of crappier in the world. And oh God. And
well,
again,
it's about humanity, to your point, like and who do you side with? It's like, it's a political debate we're even still having. Okay, well, maybe you prepared, but should you share people who didn't? Should you condemn them to die? They're your friends, they screwed up, but you don't, literally, there isn't enough. It's such a compelling argument, you figuring out who's wrong, and then it just spirals. No one's right. It's in 25 minutes. It's astonishing.
It's like it's a realization that it wasn't about building the shelter. It was about, I think it's a Desmond Tutu quote says, "We're so busy pulling people out of the river, we should really be talking about who's throwing them in upstream."
But yeah, you talked about he'd written tons of other things. I do want to mention, because I find that people still are surprised. It's one of those, it's self a twist. They are surprised until they realize they're not, that he wrote Planet of the Apes. Because it's like, oh, well, of course, it's one of the more famous twists. But once again, beyond the twist, it is in the original a classic Serling piece on humanity. The idea of the misanthrope realizing that, he leaves originally saying out there has to be something better than man. That's why I did this. And then realizing, no, I'm going to be humanity's champion, and saying at the end, it's like, we were here before and we were better than you. But again, that's all. It's, forget the ending. It's all the stuff that that Serling believed is in that piece.
There's a lot of Serling in there. Somebody else came in and did the rewrite, but it was, as I understand, it was largely because the production itself had to be scaled down a little bit. But I was reading something recently that absolutely, the setup and the ending are pure Rod Serling. It's interesting. I never realized it until you mentioned it just now, but maybe it's because it has to be. Maybe it's because we're listening to Charlton Heston, who's not my favorite actor. But I mean, can you imagine like somebody other than Charlton Heston saying that opening monologue?
Mm-hmm.
And I just realized, oh, right, you just reminded me of the language of the thing, and unfortunately, I just keep hearing Charlton Heston, who's not, you damn dirty ape. Also, I think his most successful screenplay is 7 Days in May, in terms of what he's talking about there. Also, his Playhouse 90s are powerful. His work in the 70s, what he tried to do on Night Gallery, what he could have done on Night Gallery, what he wasn't able to do on Night Gallery. It's all kind of sad.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is why he decided his life ahead was going to be teaching, and he was getting quite a reputation. I think as a great teacher. And I think people say, would he be writing today? I don't know. I'm pretty sure if he was around, he'd be teaching today.
With Night Gallery, when you say was set, it was just challenges with, like, how would you describe the situation with that particular show compared to Twilight Zone and his?
I think the problem with Twilight Zone was that Rod Serling not only he created the Twilight Zone and he was the executive producer, and we worked with 3 really good producers over the life of the show, but it was always his show. And as I understand it, he did not want to put himself through the job of being an executive producer again. It was just too strenuous. So the deal he made with Universal was that he is not an executive producer on Night Gallery. He assumed that what he had done in the previous 10, 15 years in the history of television, including 6 Emmys, more than any single writer ever won, including 3 in a row for writing, he assumed he would be listened to and his word would have some power. He wasn't an executive producer. He didn't have the position to back it up. The show deteriorated because of that. It was a time when television was becoming a product and Universal was a factory. And the result of it was, for him personally, disappointing, because one of the things they did when he wasn't an executive producer, they still put a possessive credit on it. It's Rod Serling's Night Gallery.
Mhm.
And he says things, and he's done it wasn't. It's just so spotty. So the beauty and the memorable stuff in Night Gallery is a little harder to find, and its reputation is a little bit of a memory of a missed opportunity. It could have been something else, and it wasn't. What's in there, some of it's really good, some of it's entertaining, and some of it's, whoa, I don't quite understand what I'm watching here. But it was long. It could have worked, and it was very painful for him. And he was not treated with the respect. Well, yes, shocking thing. He was not treated with respect by the television industry in the latter portion of his life.
It is a shame, I guess, today. I mean, we talked about him writing 90 scripts. Today in the streaming world, if he'd gotten a deal, half of that is an entire run of many Emmy-winning shows now, and he'd have all the time in the world to do it. The TV show Severance, I remember it was coming back, and I looked up my review of it. I'd reviewed the series. It was like, wait a minute, that was 3 years ago. My God.
Yeah.
It's like that's I think so many times that people can kind of and
it used to be called the BBC model because they made so many fewer episodes.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I got, there is an energy and there is a dynamic to working on a series that is making a lot of episodes in a small compressed time. One of the things that happens is that you can't overthink. Mm-hmm. You have to trust your zen and trust your craft and lean into it. And you get out of your own way. When it works, you end up looking back at a script and saying, I don't think I was smart enough to write that. I had that experience with a couple of 30-something scripts where I've looked back at the episodes and the characters have been much wiser than I was at the time. I was saying, well, where the hell did that come from? There's something about, and we don't have it. And I don't think that's going to come back where you're going to have 20. The last show I worked on was maybe one of the last shows I can think of where we made 23 episodes in a season. And you're all working. It's like, it's like a rep theater.
I know
it's a different experience.
26 is certainly with writers. There's more work, which is great. Because obviously you're not going to get rich doing 10 episodes a year, but also wasn't there sort of the opportunity to, as you say, kind of experiment, right? If I might,
and larger stuff. And here's the other thing. The other, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I get excited about this stuff. The other thing is, with a larger staff, you meet more writers, and writing is such a solitary action that there's actually a place where you can go into a room and there's like 7 other writers, and they're younger than you, they're older than you. Some are at your level, some are really much better and you're impressed, and some are like green and they're just coming along. different kind of community. It's a different kind of education. And people writing today, in the post-COVID world and in the approaching world where you have a hard time convincing yourself that what's going on now is not being designed to actually remove writing. It's not. I mean, it's just not there. I mean, there are a lot of writers saying, "Oh boy, if I had like a 6-episode show, I could, just write all 6 episodes." But you'd be all alone. You would, yeah. It's. I don't think that, and they certainly don't want to pay us.
Yeah. No, that's
that's gone back a long time. I mean, that's another issue entirely about how creatives are treated right now, and how young creatives don't think they need like the Writers Guild. And I believe that when I first joined the guild, I said, what do I need this? I'm an artist. I don't need this stuff. And I learned pretty quickly that the Writers Guild is just these are people who have my back, and the Writers Guild is the difference between having a job as a writer and having a career. And I hope we can keep that going for people, or else it's going to look pretty grim.
Yeah, that's certainly true, and I think that does tie in what we're saying, because even Rod Serling was mistreated because he didn't have control. I mean, it is brutal for the creatives. I would ask you, the time we have left, when viewing this, writing the book, working on a book, were there any sort of surprises of like, oh, this is an episode I hadn't thought about, or it really stands up?
The biggest surprise, because I remember it happened while I was writing it. The biggest surprise was I rediscovered an hour episode that I had kind of liked, but as I was watching it, realized it was much more going on, and I ended up writing about it in the context of the section about hometowns, and that's an hour episode called "No Time Like the Past," which starts as here's a good sentence, a conventional time travel story about someone who's trying to change history, and he decides he can't do it, so he wants to go back and live in some time untouched by all the nonsense. And he has failed to change major events, but it never occurs to him that by going back and plunking himself down in another time, he becomes the bad change. And it's a lesson. Because it's one of the hours, it's paced slower. It has a more, what is it, elegiac tone? Yeah. And it is, and when he makes his decision, that he realizes that not only has he really mucked it up by going back to try and protect himself. The character has a wonderful speech about, like, it's the past belongs to the people who live in it. It's not for people walking by and looking in a window. And he makes a decision to go back to his present and work in his present. It's very simple, but I was surprised at it's an hour episode, and it's got time, and it breathes in a slightly different way. And my favorite hour episode is, and I would have read the book if it was just to write about On Thursday We Leave for Home.
Oh yeah.
Which you could make an argument, not a monster in sight, not a real twist in sight, but arguably the best, most successful script of the Twilight Zone. It's one of his. I think if he had written that alone justifies the Twilight Zone in so much. It's an astonishing essay on power and purpose and authority. And it just so frigging subtle and beautiful, and a wonderful, wonderful showcase for James Whitmore and I've forgotten the actor's name. Who plays the card? I'm having a John McCain moment. Yes, it was John McCain who played him.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes, he should have mentioned that more. It was a great performance. Those are the episodes where it feels like the pacing works. It wasn't just a 25-minute episode that they have to scene in. I think in No Time Like the Past is a great scene of where he kind of dresses down this guy who thinks a lot of, about war and whatever. He says, like, this is what war is. And it's a great scene that would not have been in a 25-minute episode, and so that's
It's
really good.
it's one of the first things you would have cut. It's the things like that. As you look at the hours and you realize that they had to cut it down to a half hour, you'd lose so much. Yes, and again, okay, here's the other thing. Okay, so there's that character dressing down someone speaking about, manifest destiny. Because Serling is saying this on American television in 1964. One of the bonuses of the Twilight Zone, after you appreciate it for the greatness that it is you take another look at when it was talking to people. The original run was 1959 to 1964. And if you think about America between 1959 and 1964, that there was a writer talking about race, talking about hatred, talking about lynching. He tried to continue this after Twilight Zone by doing a Western, because he thought a Western would be another way to get access to people. But in 1965, nobody wanted his version of the West, which was this. And I advise people, if you can find it, it's called The Loner. It was on for one season, and it was on in 1965. And it was all about a Union officer literally at the end of the Civil War, who walks away from his commission and he wants to find out what the hell was going on. And one of the most disturbing things about it that I found when I was looking at the episodes again was, as divided as the country was in 1965 when Serling was writing this Western, it sounds to me like it speaks more directly to where we are right now than we were in 1965. And this one character who wanders across, and it's tough. It probably should have been an hour. It was a half hour, and it suffers sometimes for that half hour. But it's a writer at the height of his powers trying to talk about, what are we going to do now? We're as divided now as we were in 1865, maybe worse. He's saying this in 1965, and today there are things in the Loner, which is the name of the series, that they just like a sledgehammer in the context of where we are right now. Mm-hmm. Which, all right, it's testament to it's an accusation to our failures and a testament to his writing.
I think that's one of the best ways of putting it. I know I'm working on a piece about Eye of the Beholder, because it's one of the ones that just popped up into my mind lately, and reviewing it, and how I remember being as a kid sort of like, this is all just a twist. It's like, and later appreciating the craft, and later appreciating, like, snarky kid being like, well, how tough is it to make someone look like a pig? Like, that's not, like, how can you not do it? But that's not the point. Especially because they refer to things like serums and potion, things that you hear when talking about a lot of therapies to make people something that they are not now. And it's like, oh my God, like, you're watching this and you're getting a sense of, and there's a whole, it's in the script. It's like the idea of, like, how dare you tell me that I can't be who I am, that I have to conform to exist. And that's what it's about.
That is the statement. You must, he hits it a couple of times. But if you ever see it, I think it's probably online somewhere. And I can't remember now if I put it in the book. I probably should have. I don't know, because I didn't talk about. I thought talking about Eye of the Beholder was, maybe it was like everybody knew it too well. But at the end, there's the Grand Leader has his big speech.
Oh yeah,
yeah, and there are published editions of some of his scripts. They were limitedly published, but in the world of television, he had to overwrite. He had to write more speech than he could use. So you get snatches of the Grand Leader's speech about conformity, but I've read the whole speech, and it's just awful. It's just basically, it's like, oh, we were fools. We thought we could, no, there is no unity. There is only conformity. We will do this. We will just have one mind, one. Holy Moses.
One single frame of reference, one single.
And again, and to go to the granular level, You can pull the granule lever too, I guess. Serling loved lists. It's one of, and I love his lists, and they are punches. One this, one that, one this, one that, and they just like pound at you. He knew his way around the English language.
Absolutely. And so do you. For folks who, my grand way of stating of to check out this book because it's just beautifully written. I'm going to have all the information down below, and where it's available. Anything else you wanted about what you're working on, or we can find it, or anything beyond about Serling?
I would. There are. I mentioned 2 books. There are lots of books about him. There are lots of biographies, and I think you have to be careful of biographies because I get the sense that some of them have different axes to grind. If you're interested in the series on any kind of level, you should see or have a copy, if you don't already have, of Mark Zekri's Twilight Zone Companion, which is an episode by episode. Mark basically invented that concept. The book has been in print, I think, continuously for something like 37 years. In terms of really understanding each and every episode and the episodes that you only partially remember. The other spectacular book that I recommend is the memoir of his younger daughter, Anne Serling. It's called As I Knew Him. It's not about writing. It's about him as a person, about him as a father, and about the relationship he had and what kind of man he was. It's an amazingly powerful book. I can't recommend Anne Serling's book with more enthusiasm. I'm trying to write plays and see what happens next. I've been having a pretty good time with that.
Great.
And yeah.
Well,
but yeah, you can find the book on Amazon. You can find the book at the publisher, Fayetteville Mafia Press. And I have to tell you, I'm very proud of it.
It's really great. I really enjoyed reading it, and I say this, I think it's a great entry for someone who'd like to read a book about the Twilight Zone, and also for someone like myself. I remember the Mark Zekri book I remember reading in college, and I wrote a book, a paper on Serling for one of my classes, and this was again very streaming or video, so to be able to, you couldn't get the episodes on demand, so that was very helpful, and that's a great book I recommend. But your book is also just a great entry point for folks as well who want to get a sense of his work. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I wanted to write another book. I didn't want to write a book that had been written.
Yeah, and definitely succeed. Thank you so much for your time, Joseph.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thanks for asking me. It's been a pleasure.
And everyone, like, share, subscribe, and we will catch you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.